Jaguar's first sports car sensation, the XJ220, appeared as long ago as 1948. At a time when cars were based on pre-war designs with staid, upright styling, the XJ220 not only looked years ahead of its time, but performed like no other road car. It was instantly a winner in every sense of the word, with 120 miles an hour on the test track behind its name. The XJ220 was, nevertheless, a perfectly civilized, if incredibly quick, everyday road car. A competition version of the XJ220 was produced and called the 120C, quickly taking the immortal name of C-Type Jaguar. In this fabulous Le Mans winning car, we see the first echoes of the E-Type and even the XJ220 to come. An even more stunning development was the Jaguar D-Type of 1954. The D-Type was not only beautiful to look at, but its curvaceous bodywork was more aerodynamically efficient, and as a result, Jaguars were now faster than ever before. Even though in this race, an Aston Martin takes the honours. But Jaguar engineers wanted the ultimate in power, and a new V12 engine was the result. Even more stunning was the car into which Jaguar first chose to fit it, a one-off sports racing car with a mid-engine configuration. A car that was designed once again to be successful at Le Mans, even though it was never raced there.
For the first time for 20 years, a completely new sound from Jaguar.
The Jaguar XJ13 was one of the major sources of inspiration for the XJ220 to come. That fabulous shape, the engine layout, and the V12 engine itself were all to become highly significant in the new car's development. When XJ13 was shelved, a chapter was closed for Jaguar. But with the development of the V12 into a production engine, another one was opened. The V12 engine was first fitted to the E-Type Jaguar, although it was not until the end of the E-Type's production run that the car achieved real success on the racetrack in the hands of Group 44 in the United States.
The green flag waves off the 1975 V production race. Julius streaks ahead on the first turn and takes a 2-second lead on the first lap. Julius isn't bothered by the troubled contingent behind him.
The E-Type Jaguar is pure automotive sculpture, even in this racing trim. But the family resemblance that started with C-Type and D-Type shows up most strongly of all in the link between XJ13 and XJ220. So now it's time to take a look at how the XJ220 came about. We were privileged to be able to reunite Professor Jim Randle, the father of XJ220 and former director of engineering at Jaguar cars, with the car for which he was primarily responsible.
One Christmas, 84 I think it was, I'd got nothing to do. So I sat down and thought, well, what is it we would race if we could really go back to what we were doing back in the 50s, the sort of D-types, C-types, things like that. And then started thinking about, well, what sort of car would you have to produce in that sort of category that would A, be a good road car, and B, be able to race. But at the end of the Christmas period, we had a quarter-scale model of the vehicle that we would want. We worked out the structure, basically what the suspensions would be, the layout and so forth. And I got this thing on the dining room floor, sitting room floor. And it stayed there for weeks and weeks and weeks. Gene had to vacuum around it. It became, as I say, quite compulsive. And in the end, I'd got this thing in a quarter scale, and I thought, well, might as well get somebody else involved in this. So I took it into Jaguar after the Christmas holidays and gave it old Keith Helfet and said, put a skin around that, let's see what it looks like. That's really how it started. Later on, about 1987, early 87 I think it was, we thought it would be nice to produce a concept car, and I called for volunteers to work on this thing. We had no money, there was no budget. All we had was the good will of the suppliers and a group of enthusiasts who had to work in their own time, their own holidays and so forth. You can only work with what you've got. There was no way we were going to be able to produce a new engine for the vehicle. What we had got was a 4-valve V12 engine, which had in fact been developed for Group C racing, which was an original Wally Hassan design, which work had been done by Walkinshaw and Cosworth to produce an engine which we raced in about 85, 86. It was very powerful, but not very economical. In fact, it wasn't very successful. But as a result of that exercise, I got 5 engines. So one of those had to go into the car. That's really what determined it was going to be a V12. And after that, the packaging settled itself out. Because the central gravity was fairly well forward, being a big V12 engine, it had to be 4-wheel drive. Yes, the car did turn out quite a lot different to the one that we started with. In some ways that's a pity, because I think the car that we had designed originally was really a much cleverer motor car. Probably much more difficult to have developed as well. But it started off with a great deal of sophistication. 4-wheel drive, rear-wheel steer we had incorporated, ABS all-round, traction control. All of these things were actually in embryo form in the original car. So it was somewhat disappointing to go back to a relatively conventional motor car as this now is. On the other hand, of course, you have to accept that in order to produce the car within the time constraints, within the cost constraints that were there, it is much more logical to use something that's already developed. What we had here, of course, is the Group C engine, which only had to be detuned somewhat in order to make it a very effective and very tractable engine. Once you decide to do that, the centre of gravity went back, and therefore there was no need for front-wheel drive. You can get pretty well all the traction you want out of rear-wheel drive, so that simplified the front end. And that's, again, it was the decision really to go for the V6 engine that changed the whole thing. However, on the other side of it, the style stayed pretty well the same. It, in many ways, better than the original, because for shortening it, I think improved it. Though the overhang stayed about the same, which could have been slightly improved. The internal structure stayed very similar to our original thoughts. It became honeycomb, but nevertheless it was large box pontoon structures that we had thought up in the early stages. I think, on the whole, it turned out to be very much the vehicle that the team and I set out to produce, certainly visually. Perhaps mechanically it's somewhat different, but visually I think it represents well what we intended to do.
The stunningly successful lines of the XJ220 were produced by Jaguar stylist Keith Helfet, who explains to Lindsay Porter how he set about designing the car.
Jim and I had talked about designing some sort of competitive car. We talked about Group A and Group B, but it was a surprise when, after Christmas holidays, he came to me and said that he'd done the structure for a Group B full-blown racing car, mid-engined, and it was a rhetorical question, I guess, but would I like to have a go at designing a body for it? And from then on, it just became sort of more and more real. And
how long did it take from that first weekend to you sitting down and producing those sketches?
There was quite a bit of groundwork we needed to do first. Although I did some doodles, we needed to really sort out the package, because until you've got a package, it's very difficult to work out the proportions of the car, and proportions are absolutely key to any balanced design. So there were the discussions and negotiations with Pete Lings about the drivetrain, which the drive shafts forward, which helped to shorten the wheelbase. And Nick Hull and I did a package drawing, which was then the basis for a bit more serious design work, including these sketches. This was the first interpretation of that sketch in clay. It doesn't look like a clay model because it's got this painted Dynoc on it. And from there, we really needed to, I wanted to make the car look a bit more aggressive, and also had to start tackling some of the practical problems. A fiberglass molding was taken of the clay model, and then this was cut and shut in pieces so that we could test various options. This is the quarter scale model as it finally turned out as the presentation model that we'd made once we'd designed in all of the wind tunnel requirements. And this is the model that was then digitized and scaled up directly into full size, so that the original show car in '88 is effectively a 4 times version of that model. This sketch shows Nick Hull's early thoughts on the interior design. He liked the idea of it being a bit like a fighter cockpit, and we made a seating buck to make sure that this all fitted within the envelope and met the usual ergonomic criteria. While the body was being constructed around this, what we call egg crate former, the structure was being bent in aluminium and bonded together, because the digitized information then gave us the envelope in which to construct the chassis. And one can see that one of the requirements for the car was that the Group B racing car would need integral roll bars, and I wanted these to be styled into the design rather than having to put inside afterwards. And so that was quite a challenge to get those to be designed into the overall structure of the car. In racing tradition, the suspension is hung off the engine and gearbox. And Ken Heap had designed the spring damper units to be cantilevered off the top of the wishbones to keep the diffuser free of any suspension parts, which is also not untypical of some of the racing cars. This picture shows the huge cooling pack in the front of the car, which not only cools the engine but also has the heat exchanger for the air conditioning and also the oil cooler. But it's many times the size of a normal car, and explains why the whole front of the car really is only used for cooling. The shot shows the glass being fitted to the fixtures to then profile with the body, and Triplex did a wonderful job. The most difficult thing about the glass is that the various panes of glass are all flush and meet glass to glass, so they all need to profile against each other very carefully. This is compounded by the fact that the front screen rake is really beyond the limit of current production cars. Cooling 700 horsepower requires a huge amount of air, but racing cars actually air management systems on wheels, and they use up a lot of space. People were quite surprised at the size of the car, and really the reason for that is essentially aerodynamics. A huge amount of engineering, body engineering effort went in to try and make all of these ideas work. Particularly difficult was the butterfly doors, to get them to locate properly and to counterbalance. And in fact, on the original car, these were going to be hydraulically powered. Similarly, the rear wing was hydraulically powered, and all of this was designed to work. And the bonnet and the rear engine compartment openings all needed to work. This was the key thing that Jim was clear about from the start, that this was not just going to be a show car. The car needed to be engineered to be produced. It needed to be engineered to meet the legal requirements both for track and for the street, and also to be made within the constraints of very limited tooling.
Watching David Crisp lift that butterfly door at Jaguar cars, it's incredibly heavy. It could never have worked, could it?
It's only heavy because of the hydraulic system in there that is used to power it. The engine, it's not in fact heavy because it has the gas struts. So no, it's heavy because of the hydraulics.
It could have worked then.
Oh, it does work. Not many people have seen them operate, but they do. They actually have electric motors that operate the hydraulic doors.
I'm fascinated by the way in which your concept echoes Jaguar's past, Jaguar's history, XJ13 and its predecessors. How do you do it by instinct? Do you follow line by instinct, or are there deliberate acts in the shape of that car?
It's a difficult question. It's flattering for you to say so. I think that for me, I don't try and consciously copy or follow other designs, but having said that, I admire Jaguar's classic designs so much that I unashamedly am influenced by them. I was very fortunate to have worked with Sir William on XJ41, and I learnt a lot from him. But I think in general, the Jaguar really is just an inspiration for me. And there were certain features from E-types and XJ13s which I wanted to bring into the design, partly for continuity, partly because I love them. And but I only did that where I thought that they were still relevant. I was very conscious of not wanting to make this a retro design. I wanted it to be as contemporary in the mid-80s as those cars were when they happened. And so I didn't want to look back too much, but as I say, for me, Jaguar's background and heritage is an inspiration. It was the ultimate challenge to design a car like this, and particularly a Jaguar, because it follows on from such a wonderful heritage. But when you actually sit down and do it, and you realize that you've got these acts to follow, it is very daunting, because one wants to live up to these glorious past designs, but knows it's not going to be easy, and it was, say, very daunting.
It's difficult, isn't it, for you to tell us how your ideas, how you get from idea to actuality. Is that right?
Yes, I think that once one has a theme, then you've got something to work around. A lot of the other design features, as I've mentioned, have been there for functional reasons, and I quite enjoy the challenge of trying to then sculpt or design those into the overall project. But I think for me, the essence of previous Jaguar's designs were not so much the features, but the form, the sculpture of the surfaces, and the challenge, and very much the enjoyment for me in this project was actually doing the surfaces and sculpting the surfaces, because I wanted it to be more of a sort of automotive sculpture rather than if you like, a design statement. And I think that's the essence of previous Jaguars, and that's what I was attempting to do.
Keith Helfet's success can be judged by the sensational appearance of XJ220 at the 1988 Motor Show. Just like the XK120 some 40 years before, the XJ220 was the star of the show. In the end, of course, it was the massively redesigned V6 version of the car that went into small-scale production. But first, a number of prototypes underwent full-scale development, including high-speed testing at the Bridgestone and Firestone test track at Fort Stockton in Texas. The amazing facilities at Fort Stockton enabled the Jaguar Sport engineers and backup crew to put the car through its paces at higher speeds and hotter temperatures than anywhere else. Here we see prototype number 004 being taken out of the workshops by Le Mans race winner Andy Wallace. The whole point of testing, of course, is to iron out the bugs. And Andy Wallace stops to discuss a particular problem with Alistair McQueen, who was responsible for all of the 220's testing and development. Back in the Fort Stockton Test Centre, the racing experience of McQueen and TWR showed in their approach to high-speed testing, while the 220's unique tyre requirements were taken care of by Bridgestone. Back in Europe, even more extensive testing was carried out at the famous old German circuit, the Nürburgring. The main point of being at the Nürburgring was to test out the car in an even wider range of conditions than were available at Fort Stockton or at Millbrook in England. The whole programme was masterminded by Alistair McQueen, right down to the smallest detail, it seems.
My position is of Chief Development Engineer, and it's my responsibility to make sure the car has been developed from what was originally an automotive sculpture at the 1988 NEC exhibition into a fully working motor car for release to the public. The 220 project, yes, is a very exciting project, and my background is in motor racing, so it's not unusual for me to deal with very quick motor cars. But it's very unusual for me to be dealing with a car of this speed that's going to be used on the road and has to be used perhaps every day by somebody who wants a nice, quiet, comfortable car, but also a car capable of performing like a race car. So it's a very different project than race cars, but in some ways very similar.
Alistair McQueen found the Nürburgring circuit the most memorable of all those at which 220 testing took place, for reasons that will become clear later. At each test venue, a great deal of experimentation and modification was called for, especially to tyres and suspension, with the aim of producing a car that was not only race car quick, but was also road car comfortable. Normally, race cars and road cars are so different from one another that they're at opposite ends of the scale. But the development that was carried out in Germany refined the car's handling to ensure that here was a car that was genuinely suitable for both road and track. The specially shaped and removable rear under tray holds the car to the ground, necessary when cornering at the high speeds produced by the race car developed TWR engine. But before the car could take to the road, it unfortunately had to be front-ended into a concrete block at 30 miles an hour. What a way to treat £500,000 worth of automotive sculpture. This man's name is John Nielsen. In 1990, John Nielsen won Le Mans for Jaguar. He's here at the Nürburgring to drive one of the XJ220 prototypes at speed. In a moment, we'll join him for a trip of a lifetime. We'll see what it was like when, in 1991, Nielsen took a staggering 30 seconds off the unofficial lap record for a road-going car on the old Nürburgring circuit. In an XJ220, of course. As a regular at the Nürburgring, testing for Bridgestone tyres, John Nielsen test drives every type of performance car. But for him, XJ220 is something special.
Socket there, can you just break that and that breaks the power to that light, so that light goes on? Okay.
I think the XJ220 is a very exciting car, both as a road car and a race car. And today we are here at the Nürburgring, and the car shows that it is also a race car. And I'm very excited about it. It has good power, it has good traction, and it handles like a race car should do.
Nielsen feeds the car smoothly and comfortably towards the circuit. And as he does so, we must metaphorically strap on our seatbelts for the most amazing 7.5 minutes ever seen from a road car at the Nürburgring circuit. Once it was made ready for production, the XJ220 was to be built in a brand new factory at Bloxham near Banbury. Jaguar were fortunate to have the Princess of Wales open the new facility and formally unveil the brand new car. An event that delighted the locals and provided an extra element of newsworthiness and glamour to a very fine British achievement. The Princess of Wales was to see the new XJ220 in production, but as we'll see later, the assembly hall was never to look so empty again. Tom Walkinshaw had the privilege of showing the Princess around the specially mocked-up production facility. And although Princess Di may well have been less than enthralled with the nuts and bolts of the operation, she was clearly a big hit with those with whom she spoke. And XJ220 production was formally seen to move a step closer. The revelation of an XJ220 is never an anticlimax, even though we now know what to expect. And this formal unveiling of the car was a great moment for everyone at Jaguar and Jaguar Sport. For most people, of course, the first opportunity to see a production XJ220 in the flesh was at the 1992 Motor Show. Jaguar's clever lighting and rotating stand combined to show off those space-age curves to magically good effect. TWR built each Jaguar XJ220 engine from scratch. 2 men would spend a week building each engine. But for this video, TWR built up a specially prepared engine in just a few hours, so that we could demonstrate how it all goes together. Once the crankshaft was in place, the block had to be spread, allowing room for the bearing caps to be slid into place. TWR's approach to precision engineering follows the high standards demanded by race car practice and can be seen throughout the whole engine build process. Indeed, the XJ220's engine is closely related to the Jaguar XJR racing engine, although quite extensively adapted for road use in terms of its durability and strength, as well as the flexibility across the whole speed range for which Jaguar cars are famous. Now we'll watch the fascinating process involved in putting together an engine for the fastest production car ever built. The fully built-up engine is an impressive sight and remarkably compact for such a powerful unit. With construction complete, each engine was placed on the TWR dynamometer and given an initial break-in period. This enabled each engine to be checked for leaks, but more importantly, it ensured that each one developed power to the standard set by TWR. As each engine was run up to full power, a computer readout was produced, and computer data on every engine was shipped to Bloxham along with the engine from which it came. A 220 engine at full bore on the dynamometer, roaring with power as its twin turbos glow red hot, provides sights and sounds that are truly memorable. Whilst engines were being built in the southeast Midlands, XJ220 bodies were being put together a few miles further north at Abbey Panels in Coventry. The combination of low-tech and high-tech production systems provided a fascinating contrast. No explanation is needed as to which part of the car this is going to be. So we'll take a watching brief as metalworking crafts that predate the motor car itself are followed with consummate skill, making it all seem so easy. Another aluminium panel is hand-worked on a jig to ensure that panels are as uniform in shape and fit as can be achieved away from the mass production line. Completed panels were then carried through to the main production facility, specially created by Abbey Panels to build the XJ220 body. And here we go straight from low-tech to high-tech, to techniques that are right at the forefront of automotive construction. The sides of the body tub, temporarily bolted together into a pair, are made from honeycomb aluminium sheet. The complete and enormously rigid tub was built up largely from the same material. Each tub was fitted to a jig, along with an outer set of body panels, and all the joining surfaces were given a bead of adhesive, a glued-together technique that contributes to making the 220's body construction so revolutionary. The side panels were then slowly swung into position on the body tub and clamped into place. The adhesive had virtually no strength until the body shell was pushed into an oven for heat curing, after which the body started to take on the immense strength that we saw demonstrated in the earlier crash test sequence. On the other side of the oven, you can see the 220's roof panels covering the integral roll cage. And a more conventional, but still rather complex and curvaceous rear wing is offered up and fitted to the ever-developing body shell. The bonnet was then fitted to its hinges, and all the gaps and levels meticulously checked for accuracy. And once again, it was back to high skill, low tech to complement the high technology underpinnings of the car. Each completed piece of art and technology, skill and sculpture was taken from Abbey panels ready for paint. And the next stage in the construction of an XJ220 back at Jaguar Sport at Bloxham. Here all the elements of production were brought together in the main assembly hall. A U-shaped assembly line with 12 workstations and minor sub-assembly work going on in the middle. Non-standard colours such as these were only used on a small handful of cars, destined for the Middle East. The body shell that we saw being pushed out at Abbey panels had by now been painted, a demanding process on a curvaceous hand-built car. And the new body was wheeled in behind workstation number 1. So that paint and panels were not damaged during the build-up process, each car was fitted with special protective pads. At the first couple of workstations, components that would have been difficult to get at later were fitted up. While at workstation 3, it was time to fit the XJ220's extraordinary fuel cell. If you're wondering how a small hole like that takes a large capacity fuel tank, here's the answer. The flexible container was folded into a special pattern and slid into the aperture in the rear bulkhead. It was a tricky job to ensure that the rubber diaphragm went in without sustaining any sort of damage. Next, blocks of semi-rigid foam were inserted into the tank, maintaining its shape and preventing fuel surge. This closing plate sealed the tank off and carried the fuel gauge sender unit. Quite a lot of the interior and trim was put in before the engine was fitted. Meanwhile, just inside the turn of the U at workstation 7, the powertrain was built up, including the tricky business of fitting the gearbox to the engine. Station 7 was the busiest of all of the assembly stations, since as well as the powertrain sub-assembly, all the rear suspension and rear brakes had to be fitted up and all the connections made. The XJ220 turned the corner in more ways than one, as it became a real car for the first time. The engine was lifted into the car at station 7, bolted into place, filled up with fluids, and all the final connections made. Since TWR had already turned the engine into a running unit, it only remained to give it a final computer-assisted test to ensure that everything ran as it should. Next, the remainder of the interior trim panels, seats and steering wheel were fitted up, and then it was time to load the tailgate, the roof, and to bond that extraordinary piece of triplex glass into the windscreen aperture. The doors had been removed from the car at workstation 1 in order to improve access, and these were built up in the central area, ready for refitting at station 10. Stations 11 and 12 were used for final fitting and checking, and all through the whole production process, a build log was maintained on each vehicle, verifying engine power, safety checks, and listing all the quality checks that were carried out. Finally, each car was given a shakedown of at least 100 miles at the Millbrook test track, including at least one high-speed run. In some cases, probably the only one these expensive toys will ever get. Then, in 1993, Jaguar was back at the Le Mans 24-hour race with the XJ220C. In the last few hours, with 2 cars out of the race, the remaining 220C, driven by John Nielsen, David Brabham and David Coulthard, was in a strong position.
Well, obviously I'm excited. We haven't got far to go, and John Nielsen's out there at the moment. The car's running quite nicely, so we expect to finish and hopefully come home with a win.
And even Sir Jack now wears a smile. Danish driver John Nielsen is at the wheel for the last stint, keeping that 2 laps cushion between Jaguar and Porsche. As the clock reaches the magic 4, the crowd erupts with delight. The home team, Peugeot, have won a memorable 1-2-3 victory over the faster, though trouble-plagued Toyotas. And on the road, the Jaguar has triumphed over the Porsches in the GT class.
This very moment in time, absolutely delighted. Couldn't be better. Tremendous.
A memorable victory and a pointer for the way ahead at Le Mans.
The Jaguar success was later spoiled by a technical disqualification. But it's amazing to realize that road-going XJ220s are actually more powerful than those that ran at Le Mans.